Greetings. This will be the 8th video in a series regarding the direct corresponding relationship between major earthquakes and the solar eclipse. This video will be focused on New Zealand, and specifically focused for the years of 2026 through 2029 due to multiple significant solar eclipse movements that will be moving across and through mainland New Zealand. Agencies across New Zealand have made it public that there's a greater than 75% chance that the Alpine Fault system will rupture and produce a magnitude 8 or greater earthquake over the next 50 years. This is an upgrade from previous estimation and percentages. This is an alarming statement. But if we have a look under a solar eclipse investigation, I found 3 future windows that may present a possible time frame where this major earthquake, possibly 8 magnitude or greater for the Alpine Fault, could take place. As mentioned, the last major Alpine Fault rupture took place back in 1717, and we are told that on average this fault zone snaps on average every 250 years. Right now we are 307 years and counting since its last event of 1717, and essentially overdue for the next. We have multiple solar eclipse motions that are very significant from the years of 2025 through 2028. This cluster of eclipses should initiate very strong earthquake events comparable to the series of major earthquakes back from the years of 1929 through 1934, which had 4 separate earthquake events registered over 7 magnitude across mainland New Zealand with a significant loss of life. I am concerned that this upcoming period from the years of 2026 through 2029 could be just as significant, if not worse, where we may get an earthquake registered over 8 magnitude or a cluster of earthquakes registered over 7 magnitude at the very least. We're now looking at the annual solar eclipse of 2026 and its hypersymmetric appearance into the annual solar eclipse of 1715, which preceded the major earthquake of 1717 by 2 years. Note the New Zealand position in both maps marked in the red arrow and the shadow side of the Earth. Also note the termination node of the eclipse marked with the blue square and their proximity to Antarctica. Now, if this was a trigger for the Alpine Fault earthquake of 1717, then I will expect a similar sort of reaction just after 2026. I am concerned with the symmetry of both of these eclipses. There is a slight offset, however, with the upcoming 2026 solar eclipse. We note that it's slightly further away, and its termination point or end point just entering through the periphery of Antarctica, while the 1715 solar eclipse is entering through the Pacific Ocean just through Antarctica. Note that they're both aiming right at the base of New Zealand if we were to continue that motion. Just taking it a step further, looking at the 1715 solar eclipse and both solar eclipses of that year, note that if we continue the motion and line of the solar eclipse in May 1715, it runs through the Alpine Fault. The same year, October 27, 1715, we had a total solar eclipse, and what I've done is I've mapped both of these and its antipodes across the other side of the Earth, and we see an interesting correlation. Why is that important? Because the antipodes of the Alpine Fault shows an interesting signature to this location. We've now plotted the Alpine Fault and its antipodal point across the Earth. Note that the antipodes of the Alpine Fault is stretching just north of Portugal into Spain and then stretching out offshore, which is an interesting correlation. And note the red dots, Dunedin being the top, Christchurch, then we've got Wellington and Auckland stretching down from north to south. We've now plotted both 2026 solar eclipses in map format showing their antipode. Plotted in red the annual solar eclipse February 2026, and plotted in blue the total solar eclipse of August. Note their crossing point with respect to the 1715 solar eclipses, which are very close to each other. So if the 1715 solar eclipses were an indication and trigger for the Alpine Fault rupture, I'm concerned that the 2026 is also showing a similar theme. Now showing another solar eclipse and antipodal reflection to further support this correlation. Both the 1842 eclipses show New Zealand and its antipode circled in blue. The New Zealand side showing a termination just south of New Zealand, while the Spain side shows a direct termination. Now plotting the Spain antipode, it crosses the exact point of the 1843 Wanganui earthquake magnitude 7, which occurred the following year. Hardly a coincidental reflection. Now if we look back at the 1715 eclipse, note its branch number, Saros cycle 119, it's identical. So the same eclipse cycle has a future step and earthquake relationship, and we also get an antipode validation with the next eclipse of that same year linked into an earthquake event in the same country. 2 powerful solar eclipses of 1853 and 1854. This time the New Zealand side has a close termination, while the other side across Spain has a close crossing and antipode reflection. The result was substantial. Mount Taranaki erupted in 1854, a significant eruption, and the following year a massive 8.2 magnitude earthquake struck the Wairarapa region. This uplifted a landmass upwards of 15 metres, a significant earthquake, and this shows the exceptional power and movement that I only attribute to termination nodes of the solar eclipse. This massive earthquake in 1855 not only had a solar eclipse termination 2 years prior, but the exact date, January 23rd, reveals much more celestial clues. We had a supermoon and 2 planetary alignments that coincided within days of this earthquake event. Earth-Mercury-Sun planetary alignment 2 days before the earthquake, and Venus-Earth-Jupiter were in alignment 4 days prior to the earthquake, and not only that, we had the supermoon occurring just 4 or 5 days prior to this major event. We'll get that same symmetry early February 2028, Earth-Mercury-Sun, and Venus-Earth-Jupiter will align within 3 days of each other, just 4 or 5 days prior to the supermoon of 2028. So this will be the time frame to watch, definitely February 2028, for a significant earthquake across the New Zealand mainland. We're now looking at both solar eclipses of 2028 and their antipodal trace movement. The annual solar eclipse of January marked in red, and the total solar eclipse of July marked in blue, and we get a worrying picture with an Alpine Fault crossing and near termination being the main player, while we get an antipode reflection crossing the Hikurangi subduction zone, which is significantly worrying. It couldn't get much worse. These multiple solar eclipse movements are a worry, and it is a high indication that New Zealand will become very seismically active from 2026 right through the end of the decade. There could be multiple earthquake events to worry about, and potentially even a volcanic eruption. New Zealand is one of the most dangerous places on Earth in terms of earthquakes, with 21 earthquake events being registered since 1900, greater than 7 magnitude. Note the lack of quakes along the central Alpine Fault section. New Zealand quakes tend to come in clumps with periods of quiet. We are now moving out of a quiet phase, it seems, and moving into an active phase. I feel the Pahiatua earthquake in 2016 was a stabilising pin keeping the Alpine Fault in sleep mode or in hibernation. The worry is that these multiple eclipse movements may reawaken the sleeping giant. The last 20 years, New Zealand has gone through an active phase of seismicity, beginning in 2007, where a 6.8 magnitude earthquake struck the North Island and Gisborne. 2009, the South Island, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck Dusky Sound. 2010, a 7.1 magnitude earthquake struck Darfield, Canterbury, and the follow-up 2011 Christchurch earthquake, magnitude 6.3. 2 earthquakes registered 6.5 in 2013 in the Cook Strait region, and then the very large earthquake, magnitude 7.9, that struck Pahiatua in 2016, and it's been relatively quiet since. We're going to be looking a little bit more closely at the 2016 Pahiatua earthquake that registered magnitude 7.9, looking at this a little bit more closely with the related solar eclipse termination nodes. I found another interesting dynamic that must be mentioned, and a reflection that ties us back into 2027, which may see another significant earthquake event based on this correlation of solar eclipses. We get a similar reflection to the 2016 Pahiatua earthquake coming in 2027 solar eclipses, as we marry up the termination nodes of both solar eclipses, although this time in 2027 it will be inverted, as the August solar eclipse comes first and the February comes after. That may imply that this supermoon of 2027 and 2028 could be significant in terms of earthquake potential, but if we marry up the lines or the termination point of these eclipses, it may imply that the earthquake event may be just north of New Zealand, potentially south of the Kermadec Islands. It may receive a very significant earthquake event in either 2027 supermoon date or February 2028 supermoon date. To help us isolate potential timeframes for a major earthquake for the New Zealand mainland, we need to use the lunar perigee or supermoon combined into the Earth-Mercury-Sun planetary alignment. When combined closely within 5 days, it has correlated 15 times with past major earthquakes across New Zealand. Looking ahead, utilising the lunar perigee and alignment of Sun-Mercury, I found 3 possible timeframes that stand out as potential windows for major geophysical events for New Zealand during the solar eclipses between 2026 through 2029. Timeframes to watch: January 1st, 2027, there's 8 days of separation between the supermoon and the Mercury-Sun conjunction. March 26, 2029, there's 4 days of separation between the supermoon of that year and the alignment between Mercury, Earth and Sun. And December 31st also has 1 day of separation, although it's not a supermoon. It will be a lunar perigee, its 6th closest approach to the Earth for the year, but another significant time frame to watch and monitor. So there are 3 time frames to watch. It is worth noting that the 2026 December is a supermoon, and January the following month is also a supermoon. Very interesting occurrence that's taking place from 2026 through 2027. On the same day as the Pahiatua earthquake of 2016, we had the Uranus square Venus aspect taking place simultaneously, which is an interesting aspect. When we combine this with the lunar perigee or supermoon and the planetary alignment between Mercury, Earth and Sun, we have another interesting correlation that must be looked at. July 6, 2011, a magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck the Kermadec Islands, sharing the same symmetry with the lunar perigee and the Uranus square Venus aspect. And note that Mercury, Earth, Sun only had 5 days of separation compared to 10 with the Pahiatua earthquake of 2016. The Christchurch earthquake of 2011 also had the same symmetry, 2 days with the lunar perigee, 4 days with the alignment between Mercury, Earth and Sun, and 19 days with the Uranus square Venus aspect. The Dusky Sound earthquake of 2009, magnitude 7.8 earthquake, had the lunar perigee just 7 days away. The Mercury, Earth, Sun planetary alignment occurred a day prior, and 13 days after the earthquake we had the Uranus square Venus aspect. And Dannevirke, Wellington in 1990, a 6.3 magnitude earthquake, 4 days away from the lunar perigee, 10 days away from the Mercury, Earth, Sun planetary alignment, and 1 day prior, Uranus squared Venus. Now, it's extremely rare that all of these aspects will meet on the same day, but they actually do. July 13, 2026, all of these aspects, the lunar perigee, the Uranus square Venus, and the Mercury, Earth, Sun planetary alignment all come together on July 13, 2026. And we get a similar occurrence in 2030 on April 19, where we get a similar theme. The same day as the lunar perigee, Uranus square Venus is on the same day, and 4 days of separation between the planetary alignment, when you consider it's much stronger than the Pahiatua earthquake of 2016 and the related geometries. I'm concerned at both of these dates, although they are not on supermoons, they are the 5th closest approach for the Earth for the entire year that the moon will be making, but still very interesting time frames and another 2 dates that we must watch closely. Here is a list of past major earthquakes across New Zealand and their related lunar perigee / supermoon influence, and also looking ahead from the supermoons from 2025 through 2030. And marked in red, I have marked the significant supermoons to keep a close note of. Specifically, the February 10, 2028 supermoon stands out, as well as the December 24, 2026 and the January 21, 2027 supermoons. They are occurring in consecutive months. Without making this a very long video, I won't do any animations, but just showing the termination nodes with the related solar eclipse and past earthquakes across New Zealand. The first earthquake we'll be looking at is a 2010 Canterbury earthquake, Darfield earthquake 7.1 magnitude on September 4, 2010. Note the termination node of the solar eclipse the months prior in July, showing and foreshadowing this event to come. The Fiordland earthquake of 2009 had a preceding solar eclipse in 2008 that foreshadowed this event. This earthquake registered magnitude 7.8. A 6.7 magnitude earthquake struck Gisborne in the North Island, New Zealand in 2007. It was preceded 2 years prior with a significant solar eclipse foreshadowing this event to come. A very strong solar eclipse termination across New Zealand in 1965 foreshadowed a powerful earthquake to come. And we got one in 1968. The inaugural earthquake, registered magnitude 7.1, struck the region. We're now looking at the 1917 solar eclipse and noting that there were 2 earthquakes that could be attributed. Note that in November the following year, we had a strong earthquake just south of New Zealand, registered magnitude 6.8, and the Hawke's Bay had a significant earthquake, registered 7 magnitude in 1921. The 1920 solar eclipse also had a very interesting termination of light between light and dark, and we note the position of the Hawke's Bay region at the time of termination of the third contact of the moon as it's exiting its solar eclipse. We had a cluster of two powerful solar eclipses in 1925 and 1927 that foreshadowed strong shaking for the New Zealand mainland. There was a series of earthquakes that struck the New Zealand mainland from 1929 through 1931. They were highly volatile and powerful. A magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck in March of 1929 in Arthur's Pass. Murchison had a 7.8 magnitude earthquake and a 7.3 aftershock. And in 1931, Hawke's Bay had a 7.8 magnitude earthquake with a moderate tsunami. These are significant, powerful earthquakes, and we had two powerful solar eclipses that preceded these events. We're now looking at the animations of both of these solar eclipses. Note the entry point is quite violent, just northwest of New Zealand and moving across the North Island. A very significant solar eclipse in 1925. We're now looking at the 1927 solar eclipse and note that it's also very powerful. Note its entry point coming at a different angle, forming a cross over the North Island, New Zealand, when compared to the previous solar eclipse. When we get two solar eclipses within 2 or 3 years of each other, it often represents the foundation for very powerful earthquakes, either multiple earthquakes or very large earthquakes. Strong earthquakes continued across New Zealand in 1934 with a magnitude 7.6 earthquake that struck the North Island, New Zealand, that had 2 deaths associated. Note the solar eclipse that preceded just 2 years prior foreshadowed this event. We're now looking at an animation of the 1932 solar eclipse. Note that this eclipse is quite elongated and very stretched, and we note that the position of the night and day portion stretched across the top end of the North Island, New Zealand at the termination of light, or when the moon is actually finishing its eclipse. We're now looking at a few more solar eclipse maps and their related symmetry to earthquakes across New Zealand. In 1881, and in the same year, a solar eclipse foreshadowed this event for Palmerston North with a magnitude 6.7 earthquake. We note the symmetry and a termination node just east of New Zealand. The next map on the right is much more interesting. 1917 solar eclipse. We had a 6.8 magnitude earthquake just south of New Zealand. Note the termination node just south of New Zealand. And this looks very similar to the 1715 solar eclipse and the 2026 solar eclipse maps that I've shown previously. In 1883 and 1885 there were 2 solar eclipses foreshadowing a powerful geophysical event for New Zealand. And we got that in 1886 when Mount Tarawera erupted, a powerful volcanic eruption in New Zealand's North Island. The White Island volcano eruption of 2019 also had a similar symmetry with a termination node just east of New Zealand. In 2025 we get a partial solar eclipse. This will be the foundation for significant earthquakes across New Zealand for the next 2 to 3 years that follow. Now this Saros cycle branch is significant as its next movement 54 years later, the same Saros 154, has a very strong foreshadow of a major event across New Zealand's North Island in 2079. So that's why the energy involved and the movement from the 2025 solar eclipse is significant, as it poses a threat and potential foreshadow of what's to come. We're now looking at the animation of both of these solar eclipses, and they are important, noting that the entry point we only see, as it's a partial solar eclipse, only the orange orb of the moon coming across the New Zealand mainland and moving southward. And note that the shades of darkness is where the actual moon is, just doesn't quite come out to the Earth side. But in 2079 we actually see a similar sort of solar eclipse initially, and then we see the moon coming out right through New Zealand. Now this will be perhaps one of the most dangerous solar eclipses that I've seen, and I've seen thousands of them. This one stands out as significant and potentially a major event in around the year of 2079. We're now looking at the 2026 solar eclipse and its animation, and it doesn't really look like much, but the animation shows something quite interesting. Note that the entry point and the very long elongation of the moon coming out just south of New Zealand through to Antarctica. That'll imply that the moon itself has entered through New Zealand and then exited out through Antarctica. So that's the main concern, and we had a very similar hypersymmetry in 1715 just 2 years prior to the Alpine Fault rupture, and this is a very similar solar eclipse. When looking at the animation of the 2028 solar eclipse, we note that its entry point is just coming through the base of the Alpine Fault, Milford Sound, and then going through Dunedin and then right across into the Pacific Ocean just east of New Zealand. A very significant and powerful solar eclipse. Okay, that'll be the conclusion of this video. I apologise for the length, but there's so much information that I need to share and make public. I'm concerned at the time frame ahead from 2026 through 2029. And there is a great potential for multiple events across New Zealand and potentially a cluster of earthquake events and even a volcanic eruption as well. So definitely a time frame to watch and monitor. And there should be an earthquake prior to the 2028 solar eclipse and potentially a much greater one thereafter. So definitely a time frame to watch and monitor, to have your earthquake hits prepared for those of you who are living in New Zealand. I am concerned, and that's the reason for this video. I don't mean to be presenting such doomsday to the people of New Zealand, but I'm very concerned about what I'm looking at in terms of solar eclipse and the related earthquake symmetry. Thanks for watching.